Elena stepped out of the old taxi and looked up at the enormous house in front of her. The mansion was bigger than anything she had ever seen, with tall white columns and windows that sparkled in the morning sun. She clutched her small suitcase tighter and took a deep breath. This job had to work out. She needed the money more than ever. Her 7-year-old daughter Sophia was staying with Elena's neighbor for the week while Elena started this new position as a live-in housekeeper. The pay was 3 times what she made at her previous cleaning jobs, but she had heard whispers about the owner. Richard Blackwood was known around the city as a difficult man to work for. The employment agency had warned her that he went through housekeepers like most people went through socks. Elena walked up the long driveway, her worn shoes clicking against the marble stones. She had dressed in her best outfit, which wasn't saying much. Her black pants had a small stain near the knee that she hoped wouldn't show, and her white blouse was getting thin from too many washes. But it was clean and pressed, and that's what mattered. The front door opened before she could knock. A tall man in an expensive suit stood there, looking her up and down with cold gray eyes. This had to be Richard Blackwood. He was younger than she expected, maybe in his late 30s, with dark hair that was perfectly styled. Everything about him screamed money and power. "You're late," he said, even though Elena was actually 5 minutes early. "I'm sorry, sir. The taxi took a bit longer than expected," Elena replied, keeping her voice steady. Richard didn't respond. He just turned and walked into the house, leaving Elena to follow behind him. The inside of the mansion was even more impressive than the outside. The ceiling was so high that Elena had to crane her neck to see it. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen fireworks, and paintings in gold frames covered the walls. "These are the rules," Richard said as they walked through room after room. "You will clean every room in this house daily. You will prepare my meals exactly as I request them. You will not touch anything that doesn't need cleaning. You will not speak unless spoken to. And you will stay out of my way." Elena nodded, making mental notes of everything he said. She had worked for demanding people before, but something about Richard felt different. There was an anger in him that seemed to simmer just under the surface. They passed through a dining room with a table that could seat 20 people, then a library with books reaching from floor to ceiling. Finally, they entered what Richard called the main salon. Elena stopped walking and couldn't help but stare. In the center of the room sat the most beautiful piano she had ever seen. It was black and shiny, reflecting the light from the enormous windows. Sheet music was scattered across the top, and Elena could see from where she stood that it was classical music. Her heart started beating faster. "That piano is off limits," Richard said sharply, noticing where she was looking. "No one touches it. No one goes near it. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Elena whispered, but she couldn't take her eyes off the instrument. She could almost hear the music calling to her. Richard showed her to a small room on the 3rd floor where she would be staying. It was simple but clean, with a narrow bed, a small dresser, and one window that looked out over the garden. Elena set down her suitcase and wondered what she had gotten herself into. The next few days passed in a blur of cleaning and cooking. The mansion was huge, and keeping it spotless was exhausting work. Elena started before sunrise and worked until late in the evening. Richard barely spoke to her except to give orders or point out something he thought she had missed. On her 4th day, Elena was dusting the main salon. She had saved this room for last because she knew the piano would distract her. As she carefully cleaned around the instrument, she noticed the sheet music more closely. It was Chopin, one of her favorite composers. Her fingers itched to touch the keys. Elena glanced toward the doorway to make sure Richard wasn't around, then stepped closer to the piano bench. The music on the stand was a nocturne she knew by heart. She had played it hundreds of times years ago, back when her life was completely different. Without thinking, she reached out and lightly touched one of the keys. The single note rang out in the quiet room, pure and clear. It was perfectly tuned. Elena closed her eyes, and for just a moment she was transported back to a time when music filled her days, instead of mops and vacuum cleaners. "What do you think you're doing?" Elena spun around to find Richard standing in the doorway, his face twisted with fury. She had never seen anyone look so angry. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "I'm sorry, sir. I was just dusting and I accidentally—" "I told you not to touch that piano," Richard shouted, storming across the room. "That piano belonged to my mother. It's worth more than you'll make in 10 years. Keep your dirty hands off of it." Elena backed away from the piano, her heart pounding. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Blackwood. It won't happen again. Richard's eyes narrowed as he studied her face. You were looking at that music like you could actually read it. What, do you fancy yourself some kind of musician? Elena looked down at her feet. No, sir. Good. Because the help doesn't get to have delusions of grandeur in my house. Richard moved closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. You're here to clean toilets and scrub floors, not to pretend you're something you're not. Remember your place? Elena nodded, fighting back tears. She picked up her dust cloth and started to leave the room, but Richard's voice stopped her. Actually, come back here. Elena turned around slowly. Richard was standing next to the piano with a strange expression on his face. He looked like he was thinking about something. You did recognize that music, didn't you? He asked. Elena hesitated. She didn't want to lie, but she also didn't want to make him angrier. I might have seen something like it before. Richard stared at her for a long moment. Elena could practically see the wheels turning in his head. Finally, he waved his hand dismissively. Get out of here. And remember what I said about the piano. Elena hurried out of the room, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. As she climbed the stairs to her small room, she could feel Richard's eyes following her. She had the uncomfortable feeling that she had just made a mistake that would come back to haunt her. That night, Elena lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. She thought about the piano downstairs and the music that had called to her. She thought about Sophia, who was waiting for her to come home with enough money to pay the rent. She thought about the life she used to have and the dreams she had given up. Elena didn't know it yet, but touching that single piano key had set something in motion. Richard Blackwood was a man who didn't like mysteries, and something about his new housekeeper didn't add up. He was going to find out what she was hiding no matter what it took. In the room below, Richard sat in his study and thought about the look in Elena's eyes when she had touched the piano. It was the same look his mother used to get when she played. The same look that had always made him feel invisible and unimportant. He picked up his phone and made a call to his assistant. I want you to run a background check on my new housekeeper, he said. Find out everything you can about Elena Martinez. 2 weeks had passed since Elena started working at the mansion, and she had managed to avoid the piano completely. Every time she cleaned the main salon, she kept her eyes focused on everything else in the room. But she could still feel its presence like a magnet pulling at her heart. Richard had been watching her more closely lately. Elena noticed him lurking in doorways, observing her work with those cold gray eyes. She tried to stay invisible, but it was hard when she felt like she was under a microscope. The background check Richard had ordered came back mostly clean. Elena Martinez, 28 years old, single mother, worked various cleaning jobs for the past 7 years. No criminal record, no red flags. But there were gaps in her history that bothered Richard. What had she been doing before those cleaning jobs? And why did she look at his mother's piano like she was seeing an old friend? On Friday afternoon, Richard announced that he would be hosting a dinner party on Saturday evening. Elena's heart sank. She had worked dinner parties before at other houses, and they were always exhausting. Rich people made big messes and acted like the staff was invisible. I want everything perfect, Richard told her as she polished the silver in the dining room. These are important business associates. The Hendersons, the Pratts, the Coopers, people with real money and influence. Elena nodded and continued polishing. She had learned that the best response to Richard's demands was simply to agree and work harder. Oh, and Elena, Richard added with a strange smile, I want you to serve during dinner. Wear the black dress uniform I had delivered to your room. Elena looked up in surprise. She had been planning to prepare the food and stay in the kitchen while Richard entertained his guests. Being visible during the dinner would be much more stressful. Yes, sir, she said quietly. The next evening, Elena put on the black dress uniform. It was simple but well made, with a white apron that tied around her waist. She looked at herself in the small mirror in her room and tried to calm her nerves. She had served at formal dinners before. She could handle this. The guests arrived at 7 o'clock. Elena watched from the kitchen window as expensive cars pulled up the circular drive. Men in tailored suits and women in sparkling dresses stepped out, laughing and talking loudly. These were people who had never worried about money a day in their lives. Elena served the first course without any problems. The guests barely looked at her as she placed plates of expensive appetizers in front of them. She was just part of the background, invisible help that made their evening possible. During the main course, Elena noticed that Richard kept glancing at her with that same strange expression he had worn earlier. It made her uncomfortable, but she tried to focus on her work. She refilled wine glasses and removed empty plates, moving quietly around the large dining table. It was during dessert that Richard made his move. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, standing up with his wine glass in hand, "I hope you're all enjoying your evening." The guests murmured their approval and raised their glasses. Elena was in the kitchen preparing coffee when she heard Richard's voice getting louder. "You know, I've discovered something quite amusing about my new housekeeper," Richard continued. "Elena, could you come in here, please?" Elena's stomach dropped. She slowly walked into the dining room, where 8 pairs of eyes turned to look at her. The women were wearing diamonds that probably cost more than Elena's entire yearly salary, and the men had the confident look of people who owned the world. "Elena has been admiring my mother's piano," Richard said with a cruel smile. "In fact, I caught her touching it the other day. She seemed quite familiar with the music on the stand." Elena felt her cheeks burning. Several of the guests chuckled, and she heard one woman whisper to another about the help getting ideas above their station. "So I thought," Richard continued, "why don't we let Elena show us her musical talents? After all, if she's going to look at my mother's piano with such longing, she must think she can play it." The guests laughed louder now, enjoying the entertainment. Elena stood frozen, her hands clasped in front of her. This was humiliation, pure and simple. Richard was using her for his guests' amusement. "Oh, Richard," said a woman with perfectly styled blonde hair. "How delicious. The maid thinks she's a pianist." "Please, sir," Elena said quietly. "I don't want to disturb your dinner party." "Nonsense," Richard said, his smile getting wider and more cruel. "I insist. Everyone, let's move to the salon. This should be quite entertaining." The guests followed Richard into the main salon, their voices filled with anticipation. Elena walked behind them like a prisoner being led to execution. She had no choice but to follow. The beautiful black piano sat in the center of the room, looking even more intimidating with an audience watching. Richard walked over to the piano bench and patted it. "Come on, Elena, don't be shy." Elena approached the piano on shaking legs. The guests had arranged themselves around the room like they were at a concert, some sitting on the elegant couches and others standing with their wine glasses. Their faces showed a mixture of amusement and curiosity. Richard reached for the most challenging piece of sheet music on the piano and placed it on the stand. Elena glanced at it and felt her heart skip a beat. It was Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most difficult pieces in classical music. Richard had chosen it specifically to make her fail. "There you go," Richard said with mock encouragement. "Show us what you can do with that." Elena sat down on the bench and looked at the music in front of her. Her hands were trembling, but not because she was nervous about playing. She was trembling because she hadn't played this piece in 7 years, and it brought back memories that still hurt. She had performed this same concerto for her audition at the prestigious music conservatory. It was the piece that was supposed to launch her career, back when she thought her future was full of concert halls and standing ovations. "We're waiting," Richard said impatiently. Elena placed her hands on the keys. The familiar feel of the smooth ivory under her fingers sent a shock through her entire body. For just a moment, she forgot about the watching audience and cruel host. She forgot about the humiliation and the pain of the past 7 years. She began to play. The first notes rang out clear and strong, filling the large room with music. Elena's muscle memory took over, and suddenly she was 21 years old again, playing for professors who had told her she had the talent to be great. The room fell completely silent. The laughter and whispered comments stopped as if someone had flipped a switch. Elena continued playing, her fingers dancing across the keys with perfect precision. The music poured out of her like water that had been held back by a dam for too long. Richard's smug expression slowly melted away and was replaced by shock. His mouth fell open slightly as he watched his housekeeper perform one of the most challenging pieces in classical music with the skill of a professional pianist. The guests were equally stunned. The woman who had made the cruel comment about the help now sat with her wine glass frozen halfway to her lips. A man who owned several art galleries leaned forward in his chair, his eyes wide with disbelief. Elena lost herself in the music. All the pain and struggle of the past 7 years poured into her performance. The frustration of scrubbing floors when she should have been on stage. The heartbreak of giving up her dreams to survive. The loneliness of keeping her past hidden from everyone around her. When she played the final, thundering chord, the silence in the room was deafening. Elena kept her hands on the keys for a moment, breathing hard. She had forgotten how good it felt to play, how right it felt to have music flowing through her fingers. Slowly, she turned to face the audience. 8 wealthy, sophisticated people stared back at her with expressions of complete amazement. Richard looked like he had been struck by lightning. Then unexpectedly, one of the men started clapping. Others joined in, and soon the entire room erupted in applause. The woman who had laughed at Elena earlier was actually wiping tears from her eyes. "That was extraordinary," said the man who had started the applause. "Absolutely extraordinary. Where did you study?" Elena stood up from the piano bench, her legs still shaking. The spell was broken and reality came crashing back. She wasn't a concert pianist being praised by an audience. She was a housekeeper who had just exposed herself to people who would never understand her situation. I should get back to cleaning up," Elena said quietly. "Wait just a minute," Richard said, his voice strange and strained. How did you—" But Elena was already walking toward the kitchen, leaving behind a room full of people who would never look at their housekeepers the same way again. She had given them a glimpse into a world they didn't know existed, where talent and dreams could be buried under the weight of survival. Richard watched her go, his mind racing with questions he had never thought to ask. Who was Elena Martinez really, and what had happened to turn a pianist of that caliber into his housekeeper? The dinner party ended in a blur of confused goodbyes and hushed conversations. Richard's guests left with more questions than answers, still talking in amazed whispers about the housekeeper who played like a professional pianist. Richard stood in his empty salon, staring at the piano that had just witnessed something he couldn't explain. Elena had disappeared into the kitchen immediately after her performance and hadn't been seen since. Richard had wanted to follow her to demand answers, but something had held him back. Maybe it was the way her hands had trembled as she walked away, or the look in her eyes that seemed to hold years of buried pain. Now, 2 hours later, Richard finally went looking for her. The kitchen was spotless, every dish from the dinner party washed and put away. The dining room had been cleared and reset. Elena had finished all her work and vanished. Richard climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, his footsteps echoing in the quiet house. He had never been to Elena's room before. There had never been a reason. But tonight was different. Tonight he needed answers. He knocked softly on her door. There was no response. He knocked again, a little louder. "Elena, I know you're in there. We need to talk." Still no answer. Richard tried the door handle and found it unlocked. He pushed the door open slowly. Elena was sitting on the edge of her narrow bed, still wearing the black dress uniform but with her shoes off. She had been crying. Her eyes were red and swollen, and she clutched a tissue in her hands. When she saw Richard in the doorway, she quickly wiped her face and stood up. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood. I should have asked permission before playing your piano. It won't happen again." Richard stepped into the small room and closed the door behind him. "Sit down, Elena, please." Elena remained standing, her posture rigid with tension. "If you're going to fire me, could you please wait until Monday? I need to arrange childcare for my daughter." "I'm not going to fire you," Richard said quietly. "I want to know who you are." Elena looked down at her hands. "I'm your housekeeper." "No." Richard's voice was firm but not angry. "Housekeepers don't play Rachmaninoff like that. That was professional-level performance. Concert level. So I'm going to ask you again, who are you really?" Elena sat down heavily on the bed, as if the weight of keeping her secret had finally become too much to bear. She was quiet for so long that Richard thought she might not answer at all. "My name is Elena Vasquez Martinez," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. 7 years ago, I was a student at the Manhattan School of Music." Richard felt something click into place in his mind. He had heard that name before, but he couldn't remember where. "I was studying piano performance," Elena continued. "I had a full scholarship. My professor said I had the potential to be great, to perform with major orchestras. I was supposed to graduate and start my professional career. What happened?" Richard asked, sitting down in the room's only chair. Elena's hands were shaking again. "My grandmother got sick. Cancer. She had raised me since I was 5 years old after my parents died in a car accident. She was all the family I had. Richard listened without interrupting as Elena's story poured out of her. The medical bills were enormous. Even with insurance, we couldn't afford the treatments she needed. I took a leave of absence from school to take care of her and work extra jobs to pay for her medicine. Elena paused and wiped her eyes with the tissue. Then I met Carlos. He was charming and funny, and he said he loved me. He said he would help me take care of my grandmother. I believed him. Richard could see where this story was heading, and he felt an unexpected stab of sympathy. I got pregnant with Sophia when I was 21. Carlos promised he would marry me, that we would be a family. But when Sophia was born and my grandmother's condition got worse, he disappeared. Just left one day and never came back. Elena stood up and walked to the small window, looking out at the dark garden. My grandmother died 6 months later. By then I had missed too much school. I lost my scholarship. I had a baby to take care of and no money for tuition. My dreams of being a concert pianist just ended. Richard felt like he had been punched in the stomach. He had spent his whole life believing that people like Elena simply didn't have talent or ambition, that they were housekeepers and janitors because that's all they were capable of being. The idea that someone with extraordinary talent could be forced into his world because of circumstances beyond their control had never occurred to him. "Why didn't you go back to school later?" he asked. Elena laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Go back with what money? I had a daughter to feed and rent to pay. Do you know how much it costs to live in New York as a single mother? I took cleaning jobs because they paid immediately and didn't require a college degree. Every month was a struggle just to survive." She turned back to face Richard, and he could see the fire that still burned in her eyes despite everything she had been through. "I tried to keep playing at home, but we lived in a tiny apartment with thin walls. The neighbors complained about the noise. Eventually, I sold my keyboard to pay for Sophia's school supplies. I haven't touched a piano in 4 years until tonight." Richard thought about his life of luxury and privilege. He thought about the way he had treated Elena, the cruel comments he had made about people knowing their place. He felt ashamed in a way he had never experienced before. "Elena," he said slowly, "that performance tonight, it was incredible. You still have that talent." "Talent doesn't pay the bills," Elena replied bitterly. "Talent doesn't put food on the table or keep the lights on." "I learned that lesson the hard way." Richard stood up and began pacing the small room. His mind was racing, trying to process everything Elena had told him. "What about Sophia? Where is she now?" "She's staying with our neighbor while I work here. Mrs. Chen is kind enough to watch her for free, but I can't leave Sophia there forever. This job pays well enough that I might finally be able to get us our own place, maybe even in a better neighborhood with better schools." Elena sat back down on the bed, looking exhausted. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you the truth from the beginning. I've learned that people treat you differently when they know about your past. They either pity you or they don't believe you. It's easier to just be invisible." Richard stopped pacing and looked at Elena. Really looked at her. He saw the strength it must have taken to give up everything she loved to take care of the people she cared about. He saw the sacrifice and the resilience and the quiet dignity she had maintained even when he had tried to humiliate her. "Elena," he said softly, "I owe you an apology. The way I treated you tonight, the way I've treated you since you started working here, it was wrong." Elena looked up at him in surprise. She had never heard Richard apologize to anyone. "I made assumptions about you based on your job, and those assumptions were cruel and ignorant. You're not just a housekeeper. You're an artist who has been forced to hide her talents because life threw you some terrible challenges." Elena didn't know what to say. This conversation was not going the way she had expected. Richard sat back down and leaned forward, his expression serious. "What if I told you there might be a way to change things? What if there was a chance for you to play music again?" "What do you mean?" Elena asked cautiously. "My mother," Richard began, his voice becoming softer. "She was a pianist too. Before she died, she established a foundation to help young musicians who couldn't afford to pursue their education. The foundation has been sitting dormant since her death because I wasn't ready to deal with anything connected to her memory." Elena listened intently as Richard continued. "But tonight, watching you play her piano, hearing that music fill the house again, I think maybe it's time to bring the foundation back to life. And I think you might be exactly the right person to help me do that." Elena's heart started beating faster. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that maybe we can help each other. You help me honor my mother's memory by reviving her foundation, and I help you get back to the music world where you belong. Elena stared at Richard, afraid to hope. After 7 years of barely surviving, the idea that her dreams might still be possible seemed too good to be true. Why would you want to help me? She asked. Richard was quiet for a moment, thinking about his answer. Because tonight you reminded me that there's more to life than money and power. Because you showed me that real talent and real strength aren't about what you own or where you come from. And because... He paused, struggling with emotions he rarely allowed himself to feel. Because I think my mother would have liked you. Elena felt tears welling up in her eyes again. But this time they weren't tears of sadness or frustration. For the first time in 7 years, they were tears of hope. The next morning, Elena woke up wondering if the conversation with Richard had been a dream. She had spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, trying to process what he had said about the foundation and helping her return to music. It seemed too incredible to be real. When she went downstairs to start her morning routine, she found Richard already in the kitchen, drinking coffee and reading something on his laptop. This was unusual. Richard typically stayed in his study until late morning, handling business calls and emails. "Good morning," he said when he saw her. His voice was different than before, less cold and commanding. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood," Elena replied carefully. She wasn't sure how to act around him now that everything had changed between them. "Richard," he corrected. "You can call me Richard." Elena nodded but didn't say anything. She began preparing his breakfast, moving around the kitchen with the quiet efficiency she had developed over the past few weeks. "Elena," Richard said after a few minutes, "I've been thinking about our conversation last night. I want you to know I was serious about the foundation." Elena paused in her work. "I appreciate that, but I'm not sure I understand what you're asking me to do." Richard closed his laptop and turned to face her. "The Catherine Blackwood Foundation for Young Musicians has been inactive for 5 years. It has significant funding but no direction. I think it needs someone who understands what it's like to struggle for their art." Elena continued preparing breakfast, but she was listening intently. "I'd like you to help me restart it properly. Research programs that actually help musicians in need. Design scholarships that matter. Maybe even organize concerts and events to raise awareness." Elena set down the knife she had been using to slice fruit. "Richard, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm not qualified for that kind of work. I never finished my degree. I don't have experience running a foundation." "But you have something more valuable than experience," Richard said firmly. "You have understanding. You know exactly what young musicians need because you've lived it." Elena wanted to believe him, but 7 years of disappointment had made her cautious about hope. "What about my job here? I need the income. The foundation work would be your job, with a salary that's twice what I'm paying you now." Elena almost dropped the plate she was holding. "Twice?" "Elena, talented musicians shouldn't have to choose between their art and survival. The foundation should be run by someone who understands that personally." Over the next few days, Richard began showing Elena the foundation's files. His mother, Catherine, had been passionate about helping young people access music education. She had funded scholarships, provided instruments to schools in poor neighborhoods, and supported community music programs. She started this because she grew up poor, Richard explained as they looked through old documents in his study. Her family couldn't afford piano lessons, but a teacher at her school saw her talent and worked with her for free. That teacher changed her entire life. Elena studied the photographs of Catherine at various foundation events. She had been beautiful with kind eyes and an elegant way of carrying herself. In several pictures. She was surrounded by young musicians holding instruments or sitting at pianos. She would have understood your situation, Richard said quietly. She would have been angry that someone with your talent had to give up their dreams. Elena noticed that Richard's voice always changed when he talked about his mother. There was pain there, but also love and regret. "You must miss her very much," Elena said. Richard was quiet for a long moment. "We had a complicated relationship. She traveled constantly for her concerts when I was young. I felt like her music was more important to her than I was. After she died, I was so angry that I couldn't bear to continue her work." Elena understood complicated family relationships. "But you're ready now?" "Watching you play the other night, I realized that she wasn't choosing music over me. Music was part of who she was, just like it's part of who you are. Trying to take that away from someone would be like trying to take away their ability to breathe. That afternoon, Richard suggested they visit the music school where Elena had studied. Elena's stomach tightened with anxiety as they drove through Manhattan toward the familiar building. "I'm not sure this is a good idea," Elena said as they parked outside the school. "We're just going to talk to some of the faculty," Richard assured her. "I want to understand what kinds of programs would be most helpful." Walking through the halls of the Manhattan School of Music was like stepping back in time for Elena. She recognized the practice rooms where she had spent countless hours, the concert hall where she had performed for her professors, the bulletin boards covered with audition notices and performance opportunities. They met with Dr. Patricia Williams, who had been Elena's piano instructor years earlier. Dr. Williams was a small woman with gray hair and sharp eyes who had taught at the school for 30 years. "Elena Vasquez," Dr. Williams said with genuine pleasure when she saw them. "I wondered what happened to you. You simply disappeared one semester." Elena felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment. "I had some family emergencies that made it impossible to continue." Dr. Williams studied Elena's face with the intensity she had always brought to her teaching. "You were one of my most promising students. That Chopin you played for your junior recital was extraordinary." Richard watched Elena carefully during this conversation. He could see how much it meant to her to be remembered as a musician, rather than as domestic help. "Dr. Williams," Richard said, "I'm here because I'm reviving my mother's foundation for young musicians. Elena is going to help me run it. We want to create programs that actually address the real barriers that keep talented students from succeeding." Dr. Williams leaned back in her chair, suddenly very interested. "What kinds of barriers are you thinking about?" Elena found her voice. "Students who have to work multiple jobs to pay for basic living expenses. Students who can't afford to practice because they don't have access to instruments. Students who have family responsibilities that make it impossible to maintain a full course load." "Yes," Dr. Williams said emphatically. "Those are exactly the problems we see every year. Talented students who fall through the cracks not because they lack ability, but because the system assumes everyone has financial support." They spent 2 hours discussing practical solutions. Emergency grants for students facing sudden financial crises. Practice space programs that would give students access to instruments after hours. Childcare services for students who were parents. Mentorship programs that would pair struggling students with working musicians. As they walked back to the car, Richard noticed that Elena seemed different. She walked taller, spoke with more confidence. Being back in the music world even briefly had awakened something in her. "How did that feel?" Richard asked as they drove home. "Scary," Elena admitted, "but also right. Like maybe this is something I could actually do." That evening, Richard found Elena in the main salon, sitting at the piano. She wasn't playing, just running her fingers silently over the keys. "You can play it whenever you want," Richard said from the doorway. "Consider it part of your job research." Elena looked up at him. "Are you sure? I know how much this piano means to you." "It means even more when someone who truly understands music is playing it," Richard replied. "My mother would want it to be played by someone who loves it as much as she did." Elena pressed down on the keys, filling the room with the opening notes of a Bach prelude. As the music flowed around them, Richard realized something had fundamentally changed in his house. It wasn't just that Elena was playing music again. It was that both of them were beginning to believe in the possibility of second chances. Over the following weeks, they worked together every day on foundation plans. Elena researched programs at other music schools and foundations. Richard handled the legal and financial aspects of reactivating the organization. They interviewed faculty members, contacted community music programs, and began designing scholarship criteria. Elena also began playing regularly again. Richard would often find her at the piano in the evenings, working through pieces she hadn't touched in years. Her technique was rusty at first, but her musical instincts were as strong as ever. "There's something I want to propose," Richard said one evening after Elena had finished playing a Debussy nocturne. "I think the foundation should announce its return with a concert. A fundraising event that will let people know we're serious about this work." Elena's hand stilled on the keys. "That sounds like a wonderful idea. We could showcase some of the students the foundation would help." "I want you to perform too," Richard said. Elena turned to face him, her eyes wide. Richard, I don't think I'm ready for that. Elena, you've been playing for 3 weeks now. You're better than most professional pianists I've heard. It's been 7 years since I performed in public. What if I make mistakes? What if people ask about my background? Richard sat down next to her on the piano bench. Then you tell them the truth. You tell them that talent doesn't disappear just because life gets hard. You tell them that the foundation exists for people exactly like you. Elena looked down at her hands, still resting on the piano keys. The idea of performing again was terrifying, but it was also thrilling. She had forgotten how much she missed the feeling of sharing music with an audience. What would I play? She asked quietly. Whatever speaks to you, Richard said. Something that tells your story. Elena nodded slowly. Maybe it was time to stop hiding from who she really was. Maybe it was time to let Elena Vasquez Martinez, the pianist, exist alongside Elena Martinez, the survivor. 6 weeks after that fateful dinner party, the Catherine Blackwood Foundation's revival concert was the most talked about cultural event in the city. Richard had spared no expense in organizing the evening at Lincoln Center's Alice Tully Hall. The guest list included philanthropists, musicians, art supporters, and several of the same people who had witnessed Elena's unexpected performance at the mansion. Elena stood backstage, wearing an elegant navy blue gown that Richard had insisted on buying for her. Her hair was styled in a sophisticated updo, and for the first time in 7 years she looked like the professional musician she had once been training to become. "Are you nervous?" Richard asked, joining her in the wings. He wore a perfectly tailored tuxedo and looked every inch the successful businessman, but Elena could see the concern in his eyes. "Terrified," Elena admitted, her hands trembling slightly. "What if I freeze up? What if I forget the music?" "You won't," Richard said firmly. "I've heard you practice this piece every day for the past month. You could play it in your sleep." Elena had chosen to perform her own arrangement that told the story of her journey. It began with the Bach prelude that had been her grandmother's favorite, moved through fragments of the Rachmaninoff that had revealed her secret, and concluded with an original composition she had written during her weeks of preparation. She called it Finding Home. The concert hall was filling with elegantly dressed patrons. Elena peeked through the curtain and saw faces she recognized from newspapers and magazines. These were people who donated millions to the arts, who sat on boards of major cultural institutions. What would they think of a former housekeeper performing on the same stage where world-renowned musicians played? "Elena," Richard said softly, "before you go on, there's something I want you to know. Whatever happens tonight, you've already changed my life. You've reminded me what it means to have passion for something beyond money and status." Elena felt tears threatening to ruin her carefully applied makeup. "You've changed my life too, Richard. You gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever." The evening began with remarks from Richard about the Foundation's mission. He spoke eloquently about his mother's vision and the importance of supporting young musicians who faced financial barriers. Then he introduced the scholarship recipients who would perform first. Elena watched from the wings as 3 young musicians took the stage. There was David, a violinist whose family had immigrated from Guatemala and who worked nights at a restaurant to pay for lessons. Maria, a vocalist who had aged out of foster care but whose voice could move audiences to tears. And James, a pianist whose parents had been killed in a car accident, leaving him to raise his younger sister while pursuing his musical studies. Each of their performances was beautiful and heartfelt. Elena felt proud that the foundation would help students like these continue their musical education, but her pride was mixed with growing anxiety as her own performance time approached. "Ladies and gentlemen," she heard Richard's voice from the stage, "our final performer tonight embodies everything the Catherine Blackwood Foundation stands for. She is someone whose extraordinary musical talent was nearly lost due to circumstances beyond her control, but who never stopped believing in the power of music to heal and inspire." Elena took a deep breath and walked onto the stage. The spotlights were bright, and for a moment she couldn't see the audience at all. She sat down at the beautiful concert grand piano and adjusted the bench, just as she had been taught years ago in her lessons with Dr. Williams. As her eyes adjusted to the lights, Elena could see faces in the front rows. There was Dr. Williams beaming with pride. There were some of Richard's dinner party guests, including the woman who had made cruel comments that first night, and who now looked genuinely interested in what Elena might play. And there, in a seat near the front, was Sophia. Elena's breath caught in her throat. Her 7-year-old daughter was wearing a pretty pink dress and sitting next to Mrs. Chen, their kind neighbor. Sophia waved enthusiastically when she saw her mother on stage, and Elena had to blink back tears. Richard had arranged for Sophia to be there without telling Elena. It was his way of saying that Elena's two worlds, her life as a mother and her life as a musician, didn't have to be separate anymore. Elena placed her hands on the keys and began to play. The Bach prelude flowed out gently like a memory of easier times. She could almost see her grandmother sitting in their old apartment, humming along to this same melody while she cooked dinner. The music spoke of love and loss, of the people who shape us and then leave us to find our own way. As the Bach transitioned into fragments of the Rachmaninoff, Elena felt the story changing. This was the music of struggle and determination, of refusing to give up even when everything seemed impossible. Her fingers flew across the keys with the technical precision that had never really left her, even during the silent years. The audience was completely still, drawn into the musical narrative Elena was creating. She could feel their attention like a living thing, and she remembered why she had fallen in love with performing in the first place. Music was communication in its purest form, the sharing of emotion and experience without the need for words. Finally, Elena moved into her original composition, Finding Home. This was music she had never played for anyone except Richard. It spoke of a woman who had lost her way but found it again through the kindness of an unexpected friend. It spoke of dreams deferred but not destroyed, of second chances and new beginnings. As she played the final hopeful chords, Elena felt like she was completing a circle that had been broken 7 years earlier. She was no longer the frightened young woman who had given up her scholarship, nor was she the invisible housekeeper who hid her talents. She was simply Elena, a musician sharing her gift with people who understood its value. The applause was thunderous. The entire audience rose to their feet, and Elena could see that many people were wiping their eyes. She stood and took a bow, feeling the weight of years of shame and hiding lift from her shoulders. As the applause continued, Richard joined her on stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the microphone, "I'd like to introduce you to Elena Vasquez Martinez, the new artistic director of the Catherine Blackwood Foundation." Elena felt her knees go weak. Richard hadn't told her he was going to make the announcement tonight. She looked at him in shock, and he smiled back at her with genuine warmth. "Elena will be leading our efforts to identify and support talented musicians who need assistance completing their education. She understands their struggles because she has lived them, and as you've just heard, she embodies the kind of artistic excellence the foundation exists to preserve and nurture." After the concert, Elena was surrounded by people who wanted to congratulate her and learn more about the foundation. Several conservatory professors approached her about students who might benefit from foundation support. A recording company executive gave her his card and suggested they talk about a possible album. But the moment that mattered most came when Sophia ran onto the stage and threw her arms around Elena's waist. "Mama, you were so beautiful," Sophia said, looking up at Elena with shining eyes. "You looked like a princess." Elena knelt down to hug her daughter properly. "Did you like the music, sweetheart?" "I loved it," Sophia said. "It sounded like you were telling me a story." "I was," Elena said, smoothing Sophia's hair. "I was telling the story of how we found our way home." Later that evening, after Sophia had been picked up by Mrs. Chen and the last of the reception guests had left, Elena and Richard sat together in the empty concert hall. Elena was still wearing her gown, but she had kicked off her heels and was sitting with her feet tucked under her like a child. "I can't believe this is real," Elena said, looking around at the elegant hall where she had just performed. "6 months ago I was cleaning your house and hiding who I really was. Now I'm the artistic director of a foundation." "You were always the artistic director," Richard said. "You just needed the opportunity to show it." Elena looked at Richard thoughtfully. "What about you? What's changed for you in all this?" Richard considered the question seriously. "I think I've learned that having power and money doesn't mean anything if you're not using them to make life better for people who deserve a chance. My mother tried to teach me that, but I wasn't ready to listen when she was alive." "She would be proud of what you're doing with the foundation," Elena said. "She would be proud of what we're doing," Richard corrected. This only works because we're partners in it. You bring the understanding and the passion, and I bring the resources and connections. Together, we can actually make a difference. Elena stood up and walked to the piano that still sat center stage. She played a few soft chords just to hear how they sounded in the empty hall. Elena, Richard said, there's something else I want to discuss with you. The foundation is going to need a permanent headquarters. I was thinking we could convert part of the mansion into offices and meeting spaces, maybe even add a few practice rooms for the students we support. Elena turned to look at him. You want to turn your house into a music school? I want to turn it into a place where music lives again, Richard said. It's been too quiet for too long. Elena smiled, understanding what he was really saying. The mansion would no longer be a monument to Richard's isolation and bitterness. It would become a place where young musicians could develop their talents and pursue their dreams. And Sophia? Elena asked. Where would we live if you're converting the house? There's a beautiful apartment on the second floor that's been empty since my mother died, Richard said. It has its own entrance and plenty of space for you and Sophia. That is, if you think she'd be comfortable living in a place where there's always music happening. Elena laughed. Are you kidding? Sophia loves music. She's been asking me to teach her piano. Then it's settled, Richard said. The foundation will have its headquarters, you'll have a beautiful place to live, and Sophia will grow up surrounded by music. Just like she should. As they walked out of the concert hall together, Elena reflected on how dramatically her life had changed. She was no longer hiding her talents or apologizing for her dreams. She had meaningful work that would help other musicians avoid the struggles she had faced. She had a beautiful home for herself and Sophia, and she had gained something she hadn't expected to find, a true friend in Richard. The next morning, Elena woke up in her small room at the mansion for the last time. Soon she and Sophia would move into the elegant apartment upstairs, and this room would be converted into a practice space for foundation students. She went downstairs to make breakfast and found Richard already in the kitchen, reading emails on his phone. This had become their routine over the past few weeks, starting each day together over coffee while they planned foundation activities. Good morning, Elena said, beginning to prepare breakfast just as she had done for months. But this time it felt different. She wasn't the hired help anymore. She was a partner, a colleague, a friend. Elena, Richard said, looking up from his phone. I just got an email from the mayor's office. They want to discuss having the foundation develop a music program for public schools. And 3 more conservatories have contacted us about students who need support. Elena smiled as she poured coffee for both of them. It sounds like we're going to be very busy. The best kind of busy, Richard agreed. As Elena handed Richard his coffee, she realized that this was what finding home really meant. It wasn't just about having a place to live or work that you loved. It was about discovering who you were meant to be and having the courage to become that person, no matter how long the journey took. Elena Vasquez Martinez, the pianist, was finally home.